Alright, we have even finer, superior recording equipment today. Prius is in the shop, not idling well, so I'm crossing the border in the van, and you get to have a, up-the-nose camera angle for this video. Apologize for that. My Antonia, I introduced last time. There's a little bit of a frame to it. I mean, it's actually just an introduction, but remember that it roots us in the present. Jim, as a kind of big shot railroad corporate lawyer, unhappily married. How did he get from, the ruralest of rural Nebraska to New York City, and what is his role now? It seems like Cather wants us to see him as this is a real possibility. Like, his passion for the landscape makes him good at his job, but it also means he's necessarily changing that landscape. The beautiful red grasses that are, like, the same as the water is to the sea, which he says in the passage for today. But that's where we're getting to. So now we go back to see what shaped this man, and go all the way back to his first appearance in Nebraska, and what goes into making him. Of course, the title of the book is My Antonia, and so what role does Antonia shape have in shaping him and influencing him? Apparently an outsized influence, a very important influence. So that's the frame of the book, and now we get into the storytelling. Now notice that the storytelling is not exactly plot-driven, right? One question you ask yourself as you begin reading is like, okay, what's the conflict? What's the kind of building tension that we're moving towards? And there probably is one, but it's very subtle, right? So this is what you're looking for as you read, like, what are the kind of forces at work that are, going to be an antagonist, that are going to that Jim and Antonia potentially are going to have to work against. In the meantime, the story is very anecdotal or episodic, right? Each chapter kind of has its own interest, and then the next chapter has a different interest, even if they're related. So it's just episode after episode, but hopefully you're finding those episodes quite entertaining or quite intriguing. It's a very well-written book. It's a landscape book. So at least one of the major factors in this book is Jim's relationship to the place. And notice what he says about it. Important early passages, he's on the wagon out to the farm, and he says, I felt like what would be would be. I didn't necessarily think I had to pray. I felt blotted out. Now, is that a negative thing or is that a positive thing? That's a real question. When you look at the language, it seems like a negative thing. But think about maybe the larger picture. What is Cather after? Remember that Europe is in tumult, at war at this time. Not at the time that Jim is alive, but at the time she's writing it, about things like religion and about things like fighting over land. And here Jim is in this kind of raw materials of a country. They can build it as they want, and there's a kind of loss of individuality in probably a good way, right? Like, he kind of gives himself up to the fate of this land in a kind of religious way. The religious language about the landscape is really interesting. It's as if Cather, the author, right, is making us think about what religion is in relation to the wonder of a place. It's quite romantic in terms of a view of landscape that is broad and sublime. It's not sublime like mountains is, but it's something that makes you feel your smallness, and you feel blotted out. Just a chapter later, he's in the garden, and he's by himself, and the pumpkin is warm underneath him, and the earth is warm underneath him, and he kind of, even more, there's kind of religious tone to the language. He gives himself up to it. He feels dissolved into something bigger than himself. And we're on the verge of what, how the Romantics felt in the grandness of the world, except the grandness is the grandness of prairie here. The landscape, he kind of wants to find what's over the next hill, but it's more red grasses. There's a warmth to it that has this kind of romantic flavor. That's the vision we've been given of Jim anyway. That he follows his passions. He thinks through his passions, as it were. So notice the landscape book, the landscape piece. There are other kind of romantic stories, that is, stories of romantic heroes or romantic way of viewing the world with emotion and love for nature. One of them is the conquest of the snake, which he says, I was a fortunate dragon slayer, and invoking that imagery, right? He's the knight slaying the dragon, but it's a big snake, but it's the real version out in the prairie. And finally, for romanticism, the story about the wolves in Peter and Pavel, which is the part of romanticism. One of the aspects of romanticism is the Gothic tale, right? The Gothic, like, make your spine tingle, creepy, fearful kind of, story that's fascinated with death and has kind of, dark castles to it. Well, this isn't exactly dark castles, but kind of is. I mean, it's in Ukraine, in this kind of tradition of, think Dracula or something, like the doom of these people. And notice the peculiar feeling it gives Antonia and Jim for days after they live in that story. That's another thing to notice, is how these stories kind of feed their mind, like they live in them, not just that story, but other stories. And it's part of the entertainment. I mean, it's part of what makes life on the prairie so good. He says the Swiss Family Robinson has nothing on us, right? So notice the kind of importance of landscape, and that's what's going on. Notice it's episodic. Notice that there's kind of a romanticism to it. Of course, this is called the Shimerdas, and notice the kind of subtle difficulties that they have. Jim is busy with his life, but in the meantime we go back to kind of find out what the Shimerdas are doing and how they're getting on. They're all here in Nebraska, as it were, starting from scratch, even though Jim, the Burdens, his grandfather and grandmother have quite they're much more established. They're Americans. Jim says at the beginning, I'd never heard anybody speak anything other than English. So this is not his kind of exposure to the Shimerdas into another language, another culture, is his first exposure. I think that's interesting. We think of ourselves as, we think of settlement as there are all these immigrants all around. Yeah, but people didn't have a lot of exposure to them. It's only in coming to Nebraska that Jim has exposure to these foreigners. And notice how that relationship gets on as they move through the novel. Okay, that's a good start, I think. Enjoy this, the kind of episodic nature of this. A lot of adventures coming. We'll turn in the next reading from something a little bit more romantic to something a little bit more realistic and harsh. And you'll see a scene that should remind you of every Western movie that's ever been made. Well, I don't know if it'll remind you, but we'll talk about that. Some of the typical Western scenes, because this is sort of Western. It's not Western. We have this reference to cowboys, and Otto Fuchs has all these adventures and spurs and whatever. It's not quite the high West, but it's the Middle West, right? Which has some of those adventures, and yet in all the kind of a flat landscape that really shapes this book. All right, that's enough. Happy reading.